play a Caro-Kann. I'm feeling inspired. I feel like we need to redeem the Caro-Kann in the eyes of the public. We haven't played the Caro-Kann yet on the speedrun. I don't know why I'm playing it. I just feel inspired. Okay, so already not a good setup by white, by the way. Already a mistake. Now, e takes d5 in itself is not a bad move, but in conjunction with knight c3, it is. I've explained that before at length in previous speedruns. The bottom line is that it blocks the c-pawn, and that does two things. It doesn't allow white to play c3, nor does it allow white to play c4, and both of those moves are indispensable tools which create tension in the center. Now the pawn on d4 is simply speaking a weakness, and so we develop our pieces naturally. Knight c6, knight f6, doesn't matter how we start. Knight c6, f6. Let's go knight f6. Bishop g5. Now, are we worried about bishop takes f6? Well, you know what the response to that is, having watched my speedrun. You're almost never concerned about a slight, visual damage of your pawn structure, especially when it comes at the cost of your opponent's development. In fact, we want white to play bishop takes f6 because after we play gf, and I've explained this before, those doubled pawns can actually help you create a more robust center. Bishop b5 is good. I think white is playing this as best as he can play it. Okay, now what we shouldn't do is go e6 prematurely. By going e6, we lock out our own bishop. Since white hasn't played this in a good way, we have the luxury of getting the bishop outside the pawn chain. Let's go bishop g4. We could have also gone bishop f5. I don't think it makes an essential difference. f3. Okay, well, that actually is another serious weakness, and it's a great move to provoke. Now I think we'll drop back to either f5 or even d7. Now that white has played f3, it might make sense for us to come back to d7, or even perhaps to c8. But let's stick with the original plan and go bishop f5. And perhaps we'll provoke even the move g4, which is not out of the question, by the way. Knight e2. Okay, let's continue developing with e6. Knight g3. Now, this is not a trade that we want. This is not a transformation of the pawn structure that we want for obvious reasons. First of all, the e-file opens and white can give a nasty check on e1. Second of all, the d5 pawn loses its support. We want to preserve this pawn chain. That's important. So we drop our bishop back to g6. Now, other ideas in this position that you should keep in mind is in the Caro-Kann in general, the move queen d8 to b6 is very, very often a good move, a very annoying move for white to face. And the reason I'm singling out the Caro-Kann is because you literally push the c-pawn on move 1, opening up this possibility. So you should always keep that move in mind. Queen b6 puts pressure on d4, it reinforces the knight, and obviously it also stares down the b2 pawn. In general, a lot of queenside moves here, rook c8, queen b6, are very good in a wide variety of positions. Now, we don't need to rush with queen b6, and I think if we're playing this in the spirit of the Caro-Kann, then we should probably focus on completing our development first, and then we can worry about moves like queen b6. So to complete our development, we need to get our dark square bishop out. Okay, well, where should we put it? Well, I like both e7 and d6, and both of these moves have their upsides and downsides. I feel like bishop e7 might be a little bit more prudent, given that we're going to be castling kingside, and given that we might want to move our queen away from d8. If we castle kingside and then move our queen away from d8, we do need to keep in mind that bishop takes f6 would ruin our pawn structure. This takes that headache off of our, out of our sight. So yeah, black is okay. F4 is a great move. I was waiting to see if he would know this idea. F4 is a fantastic move, actually, and I think the only way for white to get a feasible position here. Everything else on white is much worse. Okay, so now I think it's very important to react accurately. Yeah, so the reaction to this move, and white wants to push this pawn down to f5, which that is not terribly dangerous, but it's annoying because after e takes f5, knight takes f5, white gets this nice knight, and we really don't want to give away our light squared bishop if we can avoid it, because white's got weak light squares and we want to be able to control them. So let's start by playing h6 and seeing what our opponent does. And we'll base our next move off of our opponent's response. Now, if bishop h4 will happen, which I'm expecting, there will be a lot of moving parts to take into account. So here's my logic. When there's an annoying idea and you want to stop it, the most tempting thing to do is to make a move like queen d7, right? But that pins the queen, and that's not the only way of stopping threats. There's what I call type 2 prophylaxis, Knight h5, there's bishop takes c7, and then knight takes h5. Which is that you basically allow the threat, right? You allow the move to happen. But you've made a move in order to take the sting out of it. You do something such that the move is no longer quite as dangerous as it would have been otherwise. And one typical application of that, one way that you do that is you make sure that the move doesn't come with a threat. You take away the creation of a threat, which allows you to do whatever you want to do. So in this particular context, what am I talking about? What threat does f5 create? Well, it attacks the bishop. Well, what if we move the bishop back? And we could also, by the way, we could also castle and then respond to f5 with bishop h7, just kind of ignoring, okay, bishop takes f6 is not good. That's really weird. I mean, first our opponent dropped the bishop back, now he takes. That seems very inconsistent. My guess is he wants knight h5, which is kind of an ingenious idea, but it's not dangerous at all. That's good for us. I mean, now we have the two bishops, f5. No, I have no idea why he traded. And this is a classic example of keeping the tension, right? In fact, we might even have better moves than castling, but I want to play it simple. We castle, we're now threatening d4. By the way, the reason we couldn't play bishop takes d4 here, hopefully you saw this, is because of queen takes d4 and the knight is pinned. Okay, no automatic moves. We have to calculate the intermediate move bishop takes d4 check. Now, unfortunately, I'm afraid that it doesn't quite work as intended. Does anybody see why? Bishop takes d4 check. What's going to be the problem at the end of the line? Why can't we take on d4 and then take on e6? What's going to be the issue? So the issue is going to be, no, f7 is not an issue because we take on d4, that's a check. Yeah, bishop takes c6 at the end of the line is going to be a problem because the queen is going to be making contact with the bishop. So we have to play f6, c6. I'll show this on the board after the game, but I don't want to go into those tactical complexities. There's no need for that. Our position is perfectly fine as it is. Now I think it's finally time we have to speed up a little bit for my favorite Caro Kann move, which is what? Which is the move queen b6. Yeah, now I think it's perfect time for queen b6. It hits the bishop, hits the pawn. It essentially forces another trade. And after pawn takes c6, we have the two bishops. They're both on really, really nice squares. And we're going to have a great center. So black is much better, but we've got less than 4 minutes, so let's speed up a little bit. bc. And ideas here to keep in mind. First of all, we're attacking b2. Second of all, we're x-raying the d4 pawn. How does that help us? Well, it creates ideas like e6, e5 that put even more pressure on this pawn. But our opponent, for some reason, did not defend the pawn. Now, a lot of people are afraid to capture this pawn, just period, full stop. And often the worries are totally overblown. One thing I would point out is that rook b1 isn't even possible because there's a bishop on h7 guarding that square. And even if it was possible, it wouldn't even come close to trapping the queen. Okay, but if you're worried about that, you can make a very sort of Russian school of chess move here that gets the queen out of danger, even though it's not really in danger to begin with. What am I talking about? We're not going to necessarily play this. Well, we actually might play this move. We will play this move. Queen, but not b6. Queen b6 is a little passive. I like queen b5. This simultaneously offers a queen trade and aims at the knight. And if the queen trade happens, then the c file opens. Then we can get a rook to c8 and attack this backward pawn on c3. Okay. Now we need to keep making improving moves. And there are many, many possible plans in a position like this. Many, many possible plans. I like the move e5. You've got the two bishops, so it makes a lot of sense to open up the center. Other ideas include playing a move like rook f7 and doubling rooks on the f file. Bishop d3 is a great move too. I really like the move bishop d3 because this gets the bishop into the game and it creates, we're not going to win the knight. White's going to defend it, but that's, we're going to follow up on that. No, c takes b5 is not bad for the black pawn structure. Yes, it creates another pawn island, but there's no isolated pawns. So I'm expecting rook f2, in which case we have a really nice follow-up move. You can start thinking about what that might be. If rook f2, okay, so, wow, that is an impressive move. Because bishop takes e6, there's queen takes e6 check. Sorry, bishop e2, there's queen e6 check, and queen takes e2. So let's defend the e pawn instead. Yeah, rook a8, obviously. We also could contemplate moving the king away just to avoid any such difficulties. Rook e1. Okay, so the moment I see this move, I say, wait a minute. The rook has left the f file, which means we immediately need to reinforce our control over the f file, and that means moving the bishop away. Let's move it to g5 in order to also prevent knight e2 to f4, restricting fully this knight on e2. That would have also been our move after rook f2. So we do have a threat, and your eye should be firmly fixed on the knight on e2 because it's being attacked by two pieces, the bishop and the queen. An idea would be to dislodge the rook from e1, and once I say that, you should immediately see the idea of bishop e2, which our opponent prevented. He prevented one application of that idea, but not another one. There is another mirror application of that same exact concept which wins material, and that is what? What am I talking about? Bishop not c... Well, yeah, bishop c2 is great too, but I'm talking about bishop e3 check and bishop f2. Bishop e3 check and bishop f2. We can even pre-move bishop f2 because white has only one legal move. And again, this might come down to a bit of a time pressure situation, so I might have to stop explaining quite as extensively and just focus on winning the game, but we still have a little bit of time left. Yeah, this might be the first pre-move of the speedrun. Knight h5. Okay, well, our opponent collapses. Yeah, I mean, knight h5 just loses everything. The e2 knight is now hanging. What should we take first? Well, it doesn't matter. I would even take the knight on e2 first. I think the clinical, surgical move is to take the knight on e2 first. And the reason why is that this also hits... Yeah, well, this is exactly the reason. A move like this could be annoying to face in time pressure. It threatens checkmate. But in this case, we have a move that simply disarms any possible threats for the rest of the game. And what move am I talking about? Yeah, we just take the knight, and then we take the rook with the other bishop, and then we have a back rank mate on top of that. And that's part of the advantage of positioning the queen on b5. And for style points, we could even play queen f1 check. Very nice. Solid positional game. We didn't play any hero ball. We made simple moves, and we won a pretty smooth game. So I'm honestly surprised that our opponent did not go for a serious line against the Caro Kann. I mean, this is usually what most beginners do, but this is, this is not an 1800 level response to the Caro Kann. It's not that white is like lost or anything. White probably isn't even worse, but you're not contending for anything. You're giving black a very comfortable game. So bishop g5, knight c6, so we're developing. Bishop b5. Yeah, bishop g4. Some people hesitate to put the bishop on g4 when there is no knight on f3. I noticed that. And you shouldn't be. In most cases, you shouldn't be. I mean, sometimes it's awkward to do that. In this particular case, I don't mind the fact that the knight isn't developed yet. In fact, we ended up benefiting from that because he played f3, which I think is probably inaccurate. I think white should have played knight ge2, perhaps. Yeah, encouraging f3. Okay, so bishop f5. We're not afraid, of course, of anything like g4. Our bishop just comes back to g6. This is pseudo activity. Knight g2, e6. Knight g3, bishop g6. And the funny thing is, I was quite impressed that our opponent was familiar with this idea of f4, f5. I believe that this is actually, this has a name, and I think it's called the Botvinnik idea. Or like some people refer to this, name this idea after Botvinnik. Because Botvinnik kind of pioneered this f4, f5 idea in structures where black has this pawn chain, f7, e6, d5. f4, f5 disrupts completely this pawn chain if it works. And I've even applied this myself in a nice game that I won over Conrad Holt, grandmaster, many years ago. Now, it's a different situation, but you'll see the similarity immediately. So this position is on the board. It's white to play. What did I do in this position? Yeah, f4. Now, f4 looks like it weakens the e4 square and opens the diagonal, but in fact, it's a good move. And the idea here is a little bit different. It's not to destroy the pawn chain. The idea here is to open up the bishop on a2. Hopefully you notice that bishop and the fact that it's blocked by the e6 pawn. And you can push c5 whenever you want to do that. And after e takes f5, there's even cool ideas like this. Obviously, I wasn't going to do that because knight g6 he doesn't have to take. But after rook takes f5, this constant idea of c5 becomes a big problem. So black didn't respond, but what ended up happening is that now he has a really, really weak pawn on e6, and he has a weak square on g6, and I used both of those things and won the game. So, okay, back to speedrun. Just an example of a similar idea. Here f4 is played in order to disrupt and destroy the pawn chain, but we go h6, and then we go bishop h7, and bishop takes f6 is the beginning of the end. But had white played f5, we would have just castled. And the funny thing is, f takes e6, we don't even have to recapture. We have what move that I think it works. I think white doesn't have anything against it. But at least it should be considered. g5. Yeah, g5 trapping the bishop. Anytime you have a knight like this on g3, you should remember that g7, g5, or g2, g4 become serious ideas. And the bishop is trapped. And I don't think white has any way to exploit the weakness of black's king here. I don't see anything off the top of my head. But we could also play f takes e6, and we're totally fine here. The f file is open. White's king is flimsy. Our pieces are better placed. The g5 is now still a threat. So type 2 prophylaxis, right? You don't physically prevent f5, but you take the sting out of it by getting the bishop off of g6. Yeah, e6 is weak, but just because you have one little problem or structural defect doesn't mean your position is bad, right? e6 is weak, but it's easy to protect. You can always bring your queen up to d7. In certain cases, you can bring your bishop back to f5. And it's not that easy to attack that pawn, because if white goes rook f1, then white opens the f file. White moves the queen, and the d4 pawn is weak. So white has a lot more weaknesses than black. But yeah, after he took the bishop and gave us the two bishops, this got really, really nasty. Just to show really quickly, bishop takes d4 check, king h1, fe6. It might end up working. There was a long line here. I couldn't really calculate it. So let's say white takes on f8 and then takes on c6. Now this doesn't quite win a piece because black has the desperado bishop takes knight. But now white has his own desperado bishop takes b7. And you have a hilarious line where both players are doing desperados, but in this position, white has a very strong response. Both rooks are hanging. So the temptation is to play bishop takes rook. But you have a much more quiet move, just rook b1, and now the bishop is attacked, and as is the rook. And if you go rook b8, you capture the bishop and simultaneously defend the other bishop. Maybe black has some tactical idea here, but why go for this, right? This was totally unnecessary, and it probably also loses. So for that reason, we took back. Yeah, and here we go, queen b6. This is already a really, really bad position. White probably should have defended this pawn, but then we would have gone e5, and now the c pawn is pinned, so you can't even go c3. This is garbage. Total garbage. And once we take b2, the rest is history. The only other thing I wanted to point out is that after queen b5, some of you were concerned that the pawn structure is ruined here or is damaged. Not really. I mean, yeah, you get another pawn island. I think pawn islands are overrated. I almost never think about endgames in terms of the number of pawn islands, because it's more like, how easy are those pawns to defend? Well, very easy, right? a6 can defend b5. These islands are totally self-sufficient. The e6 pawn, also easy to defend. And the benefit is that the c file is open. So as I pointed out, we can go rook c8. We can also go b4 in certain cases and undermine the c3 pawn. So there could even be a benefit from the c6 pawn becoming a b5 pawn. Yeah, and nobody trades in these situations, right? Bishop d3, and we would have gone bishop g5 here as well to go to e3. And it's over. Rook aeh, just one more vigilant move, not taking the knight. And after bishop g5, spotting bishop e3, bishop f2 is also important, and now white's position falls apart. Okay, and that's that. So a simple game shows us that the Caro Kann lives on, and important moments were how to meet f4, not panicking because there's a threat, and actually allowing it to happen, but taking the sting out of it. What else did we do? That's nice. Queen b6. Yeah, so the queen b6 idea in the Caro Kann, even if there's no bishop on b5, can be very, very powerful. The queen on b6 is super safe, and it's sort of lording over the entire queen side. And then, yeah, not like automatically going for intermezzos just because they look cool. Ooh, we can grab this pawn with check first. Noticing the consequences of that before you go for it. And finally, yeah, using the queen trade, weaponizing the queen trade, not being afraid to grab b2, and then seeing this idea of dislodging a piece from its protection of another piece, right? Bishop b3, bishop f2, or bishop d2, a very powerful method for winning material. And with that, I'm going to hit the sack. Hope you guys enjoyed the games. Have a good one. Thanks for hanging out. See you guys